Hi and welcome. I'm Caroline Best of the Tao of Horsemanship. This is Everything Horses and More blog. And today's topic is the 3 simple rules to understanding negative horse behavior. As an equine specialist specializing in rehabilitation, PTSD, and foundation training, this has been an area that I've been studying for a long time. I've worked with thousands of horses, you guys, mostly horses that were damaged and needed rehabilitation. And I'm trying to break this down for you all so that you can wrap your brains around it, because it's such a huge topic, a complex topic. Understanding what motivates your horse, why your horse does what they do, and then what do you do with that information, especially if you don't like it. It's a behavior that you don't like. What do you do with that? Not to mention what's causing the behaviors and then how to fix those behaviors. Before I begin talking more in depth about this subject, I want to bring up the topic of nature and nurture and just try to identify the difference between the two. And what frustrates me as a professional is there's very little information and very little teaching about the difference. Most of the YouTube videos or the training videos or even the professional equine trainers out there are always teaching you how to fix or how to handle, not even fix, but handle the behavior, what to do with the behavior. Not even identify it. I want to identify the cause of it so we can get rid of it completely, but just how to handle it, manage it, and then give you a quick fix. If you don't get to the cause or the root of this behavior, then you'll never truly fix it. And that's one of the things I'm trying to focus on. And the second point I want to make is how damaged most of our domesticated horses are. That it's hard for, I see this all the time with my students, the owners of these horses that come to me, and your knowledge, your sphere of influence and education is limited because you only know what you know, you don't know what you don't know, like the rest of us. Meaning, I only know what I know too, and because my sphere of influence, what I allow to influence me, and as well as what I experience, is always a continuous evolution and process. I'm always out there, I'm always learning, I'm pushing to learn more and to get more and more information. And so for those of us that just stay with our boarding facility or stay with our one trainer, that's all we know. You don't know what it's like at other boarding facilities. You don't know what it's like out there in the world in other situations with horses, with wild horses, with raising healthy young baby horses. So that's what I'm talking about. Until you have that kind of exposure, it doesn't allow you to wrap your brain around who horses really are by nature, and then how we've shaped them, how we influence them. I would say 98% of our domesticated horses are obviously influenced by us, right? They don't live in the wild anymore, and they're not influenced by, hundreds or thousands of years of history of living in the wild. They're influenced with hundreds and thousands of years of living with us in all of our behaviors, and then what we do to them, and then how they have to survive in our world. So I think that's just a big point. I don't think it, I know it. It's a big point that I want to make with all of you, is really understanding, sitting down with the magnitude of that. To me, it always surprises me. I'm glad it does. I'm glad I'm not checked out or tainted with all of the damage that I see out there with our domesticated horses, things that they've learned to do to cope, to survive, to try, to deal with pain, whether it's emotional or physical, not being able to socialize with other horses, what that does to them, being such a socially intelligent animal species. It just really blows my mind. And then how we're taught by our instructors and trainers and other influences like YouTube and DVDs and books, how we're taught to just accept these behaviors, some of them as being normal, and this is just how we handle horses. One of the, it's a simple example of this, but it can get complex too, is cross-tying your horse. Now, I don't believe in cross-tying. I do it occasionally with some of my horses that want to play too much when I bathe them. And that means they want to rub all over me, which is what they do normally, and they would do with each other. If they were in a pond or a river or a creek, they would splash around in it, they would lay down in it, they would swim in it if it was deep enough, and then they would also roll and rub all over each other. How many of us have ever experienced that with our domesticated horses? Probably very little. At least most of my students have never experienced horses being able to play with each other in water. Horses that are in a healthy herd dynamic that can even be close enough to each other without trying to hurt each other. Most of the time we don't even experience situations like that. And so like a couple of my horses are so playful and we're so bonded that if I just leave them at liberty, which they can stand there at liberty free while I bathe them, but then they want to rub on me and paw and pull me in and rub all over me. And I love that, but I don't want to get wet. And there's a time and a place, and when I'm in a bit of a hurry, I'm like, no, you're getting tied. I'm sorry. I know I'm taking all the fun out of it. It doesn't happen all the time. But how many of us are allowed to experience that? Most of our barns, boarding facilities, training facilities never show that. These horses are usually in most of the time, especially in a show barn. They're only taken out when they're in training. Then they're locked back up. They're not allowed to socialize. All of this creates such a huge level of stress on our horses. It's unbelievable. And it goes back to what intrinsically, by nature, the horse needs. They are highly socialized species. They are socially intelligent. They are emotionally intelligent. It's just like when we walk our horses and handle our horses, or we're taught how to correct a behavior. How can you correct a behavior if the horse was never had an opportunity to have an education? And education means, let me teach you what is the right behavior, and only until I know that we've done it enough that it's become a pattern for you, a learned pattern of recognition, then I can correct you. It's like teaching your dog to sit. You sit before I give you a treat. I'm going to teach my horse to stand before I give a treat. But you have to teach that. I'm going to teach my horse how to stand in a wash rack, or how to be with me without leaving me, without being all over the place. So we have to teach our horses what's appropriate behavior, what's acceptable behavior. And so that just opens up Pandora's box. It's a whole nother series of videos. But I need to bring that up because so often, again, as a professional, I'm frustrated with the basics of what's presented out there in horse training. The basics. So here's 3 quick fixes. I'm never going to give you 3 quick fixes, you guys, because it's never that easy. Never. There's nothing easy about horses. They're complicated, emotionally complicated, not intellectually, emotionally and socially. So getting back to 3 simple rules or guidelines to understanding negative horse behavior. First, let's talk about what behavior is. Most behaviors are learned and a response to one's environment, including influence and stimuli, what influences us and what stimulates us, and us being horses and people. Behavior can be determined by both the individual characteristics or nature, what you're born with, your traits, and the situation you are in, your environment. That creates behavior. Because behavior is mostly learned, it easily becomes a learned response or coping mechanism, especially when a horse feels stressed. And because horses are emotionally and socially sentient and intelligent beings, they feel similarly to us, making them more complicated. Studies have proven that when the horse feels calm or stress, they release the exact amount and levels of hormones that we do, such as a feel-good hormone, which is called dopamine or endorphin, and adrenaline or cortisol. That's what we produce when we're stressed. In my experience, 98% of domesticated horses have adopted learned behaviors as coping mechanisms from both stressful situations and environments that are stressful. Studies also show that over 75% of horses have ulcers off and on and throughout their lives. Ulcers are a symptom of stress. Paying attention to how your horse feels about what you are doing and asking of them is the first step to making sure they are happy and healthy. An obvious example of a learned negative behavior is a horse who learns to move around when being tacked up to avoid an ill-fitting saddle or the pain of a brush or tight girth. This behavior is usually associated with ulcers, a painful saddle fit, or a bad rider who bounces around on their back. Cribbing is an extreme and learned behavior as well. Horses who are extremely stressed can develop this behavior as a coping mechanism, and young horses can learn this from others and through association. A less obvious behavior of the horse would be raising their head and hollowing their back when you ride, specifically during the rising trot. Often you are not aware of this behavior being a sign your horse is uncomfortable or your horse is in pain, whether it's their body or their mouth when you're riding. Most of you are taught to tighten the reins and pull your horse's nose down and under. This does not fix the cause, only the symptom. The cause could be several really painful experiences for your horse, such as an ill-fitting saddle, lack of balance and stamina. Your horse is out of shape, yet you keep asking them to canter in a frame. Could be exhaustion, bad riding, such as tension in your stirrups, especially when you're doing the rising trot, slamming down on your horse's back during the rising trot, not being able to sit and scoop your horse up into a canter, heavy hands in your horse's mouth. Like people, horses also have inherent or instinctual behaviors they are born with, as I mentioned earlier. An example of an instinctually learned behavior of a horse, what they're born with as soon as they drop to the ground, would be their self-preservation modes of fight, flight, or freeze, and also would be suckling, neighing, playing, and running. Some pretty basic ones, just like when we're babies. Before I get into the complexities of reading behavior and understanding the root causes of it, let's try and identify which of the following areas your horse's behavior can be associated with. So this is how I'm going to break it down for you guys, and I have the 3 areas here on my whiteboard. So to begin with, ask yourself if the bad behavior appears or seems to be more of one of the following or all of them. So the first one would be emotional. So 3 causes of negative behavior. The first one I'm always going to look at is emotions. And we'll break that down a little bit more, trust me. The second, more obvious for most, is physical. So if I go to ride my horse, black and white example is, and we're walking and we're warming up, and all of a sudden I ask them to go into a trot and they start to hollow out, like I mentioned, and raise their head, something's wrong. It's definitely a physical or mental, most likely a physical problem. Could be mental though. Mental is going to follow this one, trigger. So I've known plenty of horses that I've rehabilitated, riding horses, where I had to reintroduce everything, including all the tack and the whole riding approach. And so you couldn't even bring a saddle around them without them getting tense, let alone you could have a perfectly fit saddle, one that was made specifically for them, but because mentally and cellularly, on a cellular level, the horses remember things too. They're so used to it hurting that they just anticipate that pain, even when it's no longer hurting them. And one of the easiest ways to identify that and get to the cause, is it mental, a trigger, or is the new saddle still bothering them, is to free lunge them or lunge them with the saddle. So if you think this new saddle fits them well, lunge them with that. And are they able to stretch longitudinally and get round and track up? And then when you go to get on, is it your weight? Does your weight affect the saddle and the way it's positioned? You getting on, they could be anticipating heavy hands. So we've got to look for those causes. Definitely. So if you're unsure, you're not sure exactly if your horse's behavior is a cause of something being emotionally stressful for them, physically stressful for them, or mentally, it's a memory. Trigger is a memory. If you're not sure, we're going to break it down even more. So this is where we're now going to get into diagnosing bad behaviors. Developing you guys to be like a technician or a diagnostician. So negative behaviors predominantly fall into these three areas. Now let's look at each so we can better identify the cause, not just the symptoms. But before we get to the cause, we're going to identify the symptoms. Because that's the most obvious way that we can start to look for patterns. And we'll get into the pattern of behavior, a pattern of behavior assessment at the end. So right now, we're not sure if our horse's behavior is caused by emotion, emotions, the physical, or triggers. It might be all three. So we're going to look at some very common symptoms of each one. And some of the symptoms will be the same for some of these, okay? Some of them will be the same symptoms. That's okay, because we have to look at the symptom before we're able to get to the cause. So symptoms for emotional. Your horse is stressed all the time. They're anxious. They're spooky. They're overly sensitive. They're buddy sour, barn sour, restless, jiggy on the trail, or restless, jiggy, can't keep their feet still. They're antsy before you start a show or you get into the arena. They're pawing. They're hypervigilant or hypersensitive. They crib. They sway. That's pretty serious. They're constantly talking and calling out. They might be colicky. They might have diarrhea. They might get frustrated during your training session or act confused. Can you guys differentiate between the two? Frustration and confusion. It's very similar. See, if we don't learn to really diagnose these symptoms, and like frustration and confusion are so close together. So for me, an example of frustration would be if I'm pushing Lovey, who's already a type A overachiever horse, and I'm pushing her during our training. One, this is frustration, so this is an anxiety. Let's say anxiety would be that when we come back down from a bigger movement or speed, can we go back into relaxation like that at a walk and on a looser rein? If she's still really anxious and ready to go, anxious. I think that's pretty clear. Frustrated would be we're working on a upper level movement, part of our gymnastics and dressage, and I'm asking for the haunches in along the rail, and I know that we've been doing this and we've done it well, but we haven't done it for a while. And I ask her, and I just keep pushing her, yet we hadn't done it in a while. We really aren't that warmed up or that in shape. And while she still has the memory of that, her body might not be able to hold it, just like if I'm out of shape. So if I ask for too much, she's going to start tossing her head. She's going to get all bunched up and tight underneath of me. And if I go to stop her, she might stomp. Or she might just pop up a little bit. That's frustration. In confusion, to me, is more similar to anxiety. So if the horse isn't sure, it's a little bit like anxiety, but it's always because you're not being clear. And maybe you don't know exactly what you're trying to teach. So confusion for the horse is often them trying X, Y, and Z. Like they anticipate what you want. They don't know what you want, but they anticipate it, so they just start offering it. Or, doing X, Y, and Z, and you're like, what the heck's going on here? I didn't even ask for that. But you're giving them mixed messages, so they're really not sure. Some horses, when they're confused, will go into a self-preservation mode. And they usually will freeze and just shut down, check out, or they won't move because they're so overwhelmed. And that's a more passive personality in your horse. That's very nice, thank you. But the horses that are a little hotter, a little more dominant, they can go into fight or flight. And like for Lovey, that comes up in the frustration, the stomping, a little bit of, you know, and I can see it in her eye, even when I'm riding and I tilt her head. And then of course in the flight mode, she just wants to speed up. She's just, her adrenaline is really kicking in because she's that stressed out. So those are emotional. That's all emotional, those symptoms. Now let's look at the physical symptoms. Bucking, pawing, avoidance to physical pressure such as brushing, saddling, cinching, avoids the mounting block, they don't want you on them, saddling, girthing, they pin, they might go to bite you, they're hard to catch, they don't want to come to you because there's a physical there. It could be mental too, don't get me wrong, some of these are going to overlap. It was a bad memory, a bad experience. That's also part of hard to catch. They refuse the bit, they snatch the bit when you're riding, they have anxiety, they speed up or start bucking when you are working on more advanced movements, and that's because they don't have enough balance or stamina. So horses will start bucking or speeding up when they are nervous about losing their balance, because as a prey animal, that's a really vulnerable position to be in. They could have pain in their joints. And you would feel that. You'd have a much stiffer movement if it was physical, but maybe that's why they pin their ears, or sometimes they snatch, they bite in the air while you're riding them. Oh my gosh, I've seen it all. They rush through things, through jumps. They rush and push through your contact with the bit. So there's issues there. There's usually physical issues. I'd say 75% of those symptoms I just explained or described are physical, and some of them can be mental. So let's talk about a trigger, the mental part of this. Symptoms, again, bucking, rearing, charging, bolting, self-preservation modes. When your horse checks out, goes into freeze mode, I can't move, I'm scared to death. A lot of horses freeze and people think they're just dull. They just don't want to move. They're petrified, you guys. They go deep within themselves. We have extreme reactions and responses to cues. Those are triggers. And not just extreme reactions and responses to cues, but to environments or equipment, whatever you're exposing them to. All of a sudden, they just went from 0 to hero. They just exploded. So that's a trigger. And unfortunately, we're not paying attention. We just don't know enough. We're not taught enough. That's why I'm doing this video, to help shed some more light on all the symptoms that are showing you there's a deeper cause. And if you don't pay attention to these symptoms, as basic as they can seem, or maybe they're not that severe, if you don't keep paying attention to them, the cause is going to happen and something major is going to happen. It's just going to keep getting worse. So again, most of these symptoms, not most of them, 25% of the symptoms will overlap into the others. And they share similar symptoms. We're going to continue to break down the diagnostic process here so that now you can start to determine the root or the cause of this. So right now, you're always going to ask yourself, number one, my horse has got this behavior. Does it look emotional, physical, or mental, or all three? That's how you're going to start this. The second is you're going to start identifying symptoms. What are they doing? Well, they do X, Y, and Z. When I do X, Y, and Z. Write it down. Keep notes. You're going to need it, because now we're going to talk about the third, which is pattern of behavior assessment. Again, as a specialist, a rehab specialist, I'm always looking for patterns. That helps me diagnose and get to the cause. So now I'm like, wow, I already know the symptoms of emotional behavior, negative behavior, what causes physical negative behavior, what causes mental behavior. I understand the symptoms. I see so many all the time. But what's causing this? Now let's look for patterns. So once we have experienced a bad behavior and have identified the symptom, we're now going to get to the cause. We may not have enough experience now, and I understand that, to properly or accurately diagnose the one thing that causes the behavior. But that's where pattern of behavior assessing is going to come in. So pattern assessment is my term for assessing behavior patterns in horses, negative specifically. This is where I will begin to look for patterns, repetitive patterns in the behavior. Because experience has taught me that once I find the pattern, I have a road map that will lead me to the cause of the problem. So an example would be as simple as me going to brush, here we go, or cinch my horse up. Each time they act irritated, fidgety, pin their ears, maybe even snap at me. Sundance was a perfect example years and years ago. And I knew that because of the pattern, she would only do this certain times of the year. That's how I was able to diagnose this. She only did it certain times of the year. In the summer, it didn't matter. You couldn't brush her hard enough. You could scratch her with a mane brush or your fingernails all over. But as the dry season came and winter came and she started getting her winter coat down here in Florida, she became really pinny, would threaten to cow kick. Me too. She would lightly nip at me if I brushed her too hard, and definitely was very protective and apprehensive of anyone else coming in the stall to brush her. And so what I've determined through that, and cinchy, and with the bareback pad, the whole 9 yards, never bucking, never like really upset when I'm riding. I'll give you an example, a little bit of that, but never tried to buck me off, because we have such a great connection and communication that I'm always listening, and she knows she can stop and look at me. And so I'll talk about how that transformed. But she'd be so touchy around wintertime. And even though I never see dandruff on her, I diagnose that to be dry skin. And so we go really light with her. And when I put her bareback pad on, I put a saddle pad underneath of it. And I know that in the summer she's fine with English billets, but in the winter the billets rub her and she can't stand it. And so what she does is she'll stop, turn around, and move my leg and show me. Lovey does the same thing, my other mare, and show me what's bothering her. So we've gotten to the point, all my horses and me in our relationship, that they don't act out. Even if they got stung by a bee or bit by a big fly, they will take care of me and they will show me what the problem is. But you've got to develop that relationship for safety reasons especially, and that level of paying attention and your horse knowing that you're listening to them, that you hear them. Now what do you do with that information? So that's just certain times of year. Sundance is like that during the winter. It's been like that for years. I've never really read up on that being a problem with horses. I know that they get dry skin like us in the wintertime, but we're down here in Florida. It doesn't get that dry. But that's the way it's been. And I know that if I do certain things and go about grooming her differently, we don't have any problems, right? She doesn't pin her ears. She's not apprehensive about anything. She's not tight or stressed. So that took a long time to figure out. That wasn't that easy to diagnose, but do you see how I'm problem solving and troubleshooting and teaching you guys how to do the same? So you're looking to identify pattern, a repetitive pattern. Every time I go to do this, my horse does this. Now, is it because just of the cinch? Is it because of the billets? Is it because of they don't like that type of brush on their body? Or do they have ulcers? Do they do this all the time? What does it look like when a horse has ulcers? Yes, they do go to bite at their sides, and that's different because it's their whole side. Sometimes they'll kick up at their belly. Sometimes they'll have diarrhea. It'll be hard to keep weight on them. How do I know that my horses don't have ulcers when they act like that? It was just my 2 mares specifically, nobody else during the winter, because one, it only happens in the winter, and they push my leg out of the way. They're always going after where the billet is and trying to itch it and scratch it while we stop during our riding. So I know it's that black and white, and it does rub their hair. Sundance has been that dry that it has really bothered her, and I've had to get off and not ride. So another and less obvious or more complicated reaction to an emotional cause, something that's bothering them emotionally, would be, like I mentioned, Lovey, training one of your horses, and they start acting frustrated or acting out, and it's not their normal behavior. So the best recommendation I can do for that is, again, you're looking at repetition, recognizing patterns. When does this happen? How often does it happen? Does it only happen when you do X, Y, and Z? And then how to fix it. We're going to be doing another video next week on how to interrupt certain behaviors, redirect them, and how to change them. But right now, I just wanted to bring a lot of as much information as I can on problem solving and troubleshooting bad behavior, and how to start to read your horse and be a better diagnostician. It's so important because there are no quick fixes. There's so many smoke and mirrors out there, and tips and easy solutions. There aren't any when you have a deeper cause, especially if the saddle's not fitting. Oh, go get a new saddle. Well, that's upwards of $5,000 to get a saddle by a saddle maker that fits your horse, and not everybody has that kind of money. And so what do you do about a saddle that doesn't fit? And if you don't pay attention, then you're compromising your horse. You're compromising their soundness, the way they travel, the way they carry themselves. It's only going to get worse for both of you, not better. So thank you very much. I look forward to you guys leaving comments and asking any questions that you have, or giving me any of your insights. Share with me your stories, your experiences, what you've learned to work well for you in diagnosing unwanted or negative behavior. I hope this has helped. May you always be one with your horse.